Joining me now is Rowan Dean, Editor-in-Chief of The Spectator Australia, now under new management, by the way, new owners, and host of Outsiders on Sky News every Sunday at 9 a.m. Rowan Dean, the Melbourne protests today, 39 protesters arrested. What does all this tell you?
Well, Andrew, I'm still, recovering from your description of Melbourne, which I'm sadly have found to be pretty accurate. So I'm kind of relieved that I'm sitting here in Sydney. But unfortunately, Andrew, it's not just Melbourne. We saw in Sydney some of the vilest protests on October 8th, long before they had the excuse of the Gaza war. Within hours of the vilest atrocities since the Holocaust were being committed, we had here in Sydney. There at the Opera House, you had, mobs screaming, "Where's the Jews?" arguably screaming, "Gas the Jews," whatever, equally vile comments. And the police did nothing to stop them. And this is the problem here, Andrew. You reap what you sow. Now, what you've talked about, the violence and the disgusting behaviour in Melbourne today, well, this has been encouraged by our leaders, by the political leadership, by the leadership of our authorities, whose job it is to retain law and order. Since October 7th, they have been turning a blind eye to, or certainly treating with kid gloves, many of the pro-Palestinian / Hamas protesters. And I'd make the point that it is getting increasingly difficult to draw a distinction between pro-Palestinian protesters and those who support Hamas. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. But these protests have increasingly been violent, increasingly been aggressive, and yet the Melbourne police and the Sydney police, what have they done? They've wandered around arresting Jewish couples who wanted to attend a meeting, wandered around arresting a Jewish man for carrying a Jewish flag, wandered around telling someone else not to wear the small Jewish cap on their head because it might inflame the crowds. So we've, at the same time as a lack of leadership from the law enforcement authorities, we have had a grotesque lack of leadership, in fact, the very opposite, from the federal government, from Penny Wong, from Anthony Albanese and the rest of them, who have made it clear that their sympathies, if they are going to lie anywhere, don't lie with the Jewish state. And if their sympathies lie anywhere, it is with those who are pro-Palestinian. And they have turned a blind eye and repeatedly, I believe, through lack of strong moral leadership, encouraged these protesters to believe they were untouchable, Andrew.
Well, you mentioned the Palestinians. Surely it's now becoming obvious to many Australians what the Palestinian cause now... Well, let me put it this way. There were so many Palestinian flags at this rally, protest, this violent protest. It all is adding to massive embarrassment for the Palestinian cause. It's being associated with terrible behaviour. And I think, fairly or not, a lot of Australians will be saying, we're getting a taste of what Israel's up to, and where do they stand now on Israel? I suspect they'll have a lot more sympathy.
Yeah, well, what are these protesters protesting about? If you go into it, OK, they claim to be protesting against the atrocities that they believe to be occurring in Gaza. They accuse the Israeli Defense Force of genocide and so on and so forth. Weirdly, these same protesters have never raised a little finger against the far greater number of people being literally murdered and genuine genocide throughout the Middle East and Africa by Islamist terrorists. They've never raised their voice against, for example, the Christians being murdered throughout Africa in Islamic countries. But they seem to be focused on this one particular issue, and yet they won't even find it within themselves to condemn what happened on October 7th. And Andrew, the bottom line here is that Israel must defeat Hamas, And the problem is our political leaders refuse to acknowledge that. This week we had Penny Wong saying, I support the British government for not selling more arms to Israel. All you are doing by saying we will not sell arms to our ally, our most important ally in the Middle East, is you are saying we want you to surrender, we want you to give up to the butchers of Hamas, we want you to say, yeah, it's okay if October 7th happens again. The bottom line is Hamas must be destroyed, and they must be destroyed by Israel with the full support of Western nations, because it is up to us to ensure that our allies are not subject to primitive, medieval butchery of the vilest kind that we saw on October 7th, Andrew.